The unsurpassed, penetrating and perfect truth is seldom met with, even in 100,000 myriad karmas. Now we can see and hear it, we can remember and accept it. I vow to make the Buddha's truth one with myself. Homage to the Buddha, homage to the Dharma, homage to the Sangha. Chapter 4 of the Surangama is called The Coming into Being of the World of Illusion. Purna Maitreya Yaniputra is a bodhisattva of the fourth stage, one who is free from outflows. He's been listening to what the Buddha says, and he still has questions. So he asks if the aggregates, the faculties, the perceived objects, and the consciousnesses are all fundamentally pure, how is it that they suddenly come into beings, mountains, rivers, and all else on earth that is subject to conditions? How can the four primary elements, earth, water, fire, and wind, which are in their fundamental nature completely interfused with each other and do not destroy each other when they get mixed up? The Buddha responds with a question. Have you not often heard that thus come one speak of the wondrous understanding which is inherent enlightenment, to our fundamental wondrous luminous understanding? Purna agrees that he had heard this often, and then the Buddha asks, when we talk about this understanding, is it intrinsic to our inherent enlightenment? Or does it inhere, or does our inherent enlightenment lack understanding until we gain it when enlightenment is realized? Purna says that our inherent enlightenment is characterized by understanding only when that understanding is something that is added to it. And the Buddha points out that this is the very problem that prevents our understanding from being realized, by adding something to our original enlightenment. We have added something to our inherent enlightenment. This is what causes everything to come into existence. If something is added to enlightenment, then our understanding must understand something. Once the category of something understood is established, then the category, that which understands, is also established. At first there's no differentiation, but once it is established that there is something different from others, then what is differentiated is distinguished from what is uniform. Once there is a category of what is uniform and a category of what is differentiated, then what is neither uniform nor differentiated is also established. The turmoil of this mental complementarity gives rise to mental strain, and this mental strain is prolonged, or when it is prolonged, grasping at objects of mind begins. Mental strain and grasping at objects together create a turbidity of mind, out of which the afflictions are generated. Motion becomes a world of perceived objects, and stillness is distinguished as space. In addition to space, which is undifferentiated, and the world, which is differentiated, are conditioned phenomena that are neither differentiated nor the same. Once the light of understanding is added to enlightenment, the darkness of the primary element of space appears. The interaction of two complements generates a disturbance in the mind. That disturbance becomes a mandala of wind. This disturbance supports the world of perceived objects. In reaction to the mental disturbance generated by the interactions of the darkness of mental space and the understanding that has been added, there arises a firm attachment to that understanding. And that creates solidity. Motion becomes the world of perceived objects, and stillness is distinguished as space. In addition to space, which is undifferentiated, and the world, which is differentiated, are conditioned phenomena that are neither differentiated nor the same. Once the light of understanding is added to enlightenment, the darkness of the primary elements of space appears. The interaction of the two complements generates a disturbance in the mind. That disturbance becomes the mandala of wind. The disturbance supports the world of perceived objects. In reaction to the mental disturbance generated by the interaction of the darkness of mental space and the understanding that has been added, there arises a firm attachment to the understanding. And that creates solidity. The mandala of Vajra is the essence of the primary element of earth. From the friction generated by the mandala of wind and the mandala of Vajra, solidity becomes the mandala of fire, characterized by changeability. Moisture arises from the shining of the mandala of the Vajra, solidarity, and turns to vapor in the presence of fire. Thus, the mandala of water comes into being and encompasses the world in the 10 directions. Now, I don't completely understand the Buddhist logic or explanation here, how something gets added to our inherent enlightenment. It may not be necessary to clearly understand how this has come about. It is important, however, for us to recognize when we are acting out of the delusion of self. We are frequently acting out under self, under a self-created misunderstanding, like Yajnadatta that I referred to yesterday. We'll come back to him in a minute. Perhaps not quite so crazy, but also not so clear. We misunderstand sometimes what someone has just said to us. We forget sometimes something important. We assume someone we recently spoke to did not hear us clearly. We got excited about something that has not yet happened yet. We grieve sometimes when someone dies, but we don't know whether or not that person got reborn in a better place. We don't always have the information we need to make good decisions. What is important here is that we have created our own suffering. We have to see that no one else can let go of our confusion or our suffering. And this is the example he gives again is the story of Yajnadatta. I'll read it in greater detail. He was a man of Shravasti. One day he looked in a mirror and he saw a beautiful face. He became entranced with his face, and then imagined that it was not his face. He imagined that he had become a headless ghost. So he ran around looking for his head. He was clearly crazy, and no one could solve the problem for him because he still had his head. Delusion is created by our thoughts. When we realize our confusion has no basis, we can relax and let it go. The enlightened one is like one awakening from a dream. Why would he want to return to the dream to get something that he has just dreamt of? Yajnadatta's madness is like this. It doesn't have a solution because there isn't a problem. But we see problems that don't actually exist. And those come out of our misperceptions. And again, understanding the error, understanding the misperception, that which understands the misperception is not misperceived. That which understands the error is not itself in error. And yet still we have to live in the real world. And so Reverend Master Jiyu once spoke about a sane level of paranoia. We all have our worries, doubts, and fears, and sometimes it's necessary to respond to them in a sane way. For example, the climate change that's happening now in the world. We have extreme weather patterns. So at Shasta Abbey, which is in the midst of a forest, in the hot summers the danger of forest fires is greater than normal. So thinning out the undergrowth of the forest is a necessary part of preparing for a forest fire in the neighborhood if it should happen. We don't have to clear-cut all the trees and bushes, but it's good to be concerned about the possibility of fire caused by lightning or some deliberate carelessness act, and respond in a sane way. There's also a story in the Lotus Sutra about a poor man who gets drunk and he falls asleep at the home of his friend, who is a very rich man. The rich man had to leave before his friend was awakened. And so he had a very precious and valuable pearl sewn into the drunken man's coat. When the drunken man awoke, he traveled to a distant country and he had no idea that there was a pearl hidden in his cloak. So spent many years in deep poverty working very hard at menial tasks. One day, he chanced upon the man who gave him the pearl, who told him that he does not have to toil endlessly. He already has this wish-fulfilling pearl. The story is about the secret gem that all of us have within us. Opening the heart and listening to the heart instead of clinging to our fears, inadequacies, worries, and doubts. We have to notice that we are not meditating in order to actually return to meditation. So when you're meditating, you're actually knowing, you're actually looking at what's going on with your mind. And when you see the mind is wandering, you wake up and you go back to just sitting. So part of the meditation is noticing when you're not meditating. And when we do notice that, we become aware, and then we sit still, at least for a moment. But the minute we notice that we're not meditating, we're in touch with that which understands the error. We're in touch with the Buddha nature. It's a very subtle shift in perception. And it's like when we see or hear something, our ability to see and hear is the Buddha nature. The fact that we get it confused with and joined up to the objects of our awareness, that's where we make mistakes. This shift in perception is facilitated by the practice of the paramitas. Generosity, keeping other precepts, vigor, right effort, patience, which is the opening of the heart in difficult situations. Being able to hold those things that are difficult without anybody getting hurt. Meditation and wisdom. So there's 6 things: generosity, precepts, vigor, patience, meditation, wisdom. These are things that help us get to the other shore of nirvana. Looking at ways in which we are not practicing the paramitas is the same as looking at ways in which we are not meditating. And so we wake up and make the effort to practice the paramitas. Paramitas means those things that take us to the other shore. They are the perfecting practices of a bodhisattva. So we need to notice when we are stingy or ungenerous, when we are lazy or not doing, or doing things half-heartedly, when we are impatient, when we are wandering around in our heads, when we are doing or have done unwise or impulsive things. Remember the question that Ananda was asked at first: where is your mind? So the next chapter is on the practice of instructions for practice, chapter 5. It has to do with understanding the layers of turbidity that we create or have created. I'm not going to go into the details of this, but I'm going to focus on how we create a turbid mind. We need to examine our minds and see how involvement with the objects of sense creates stress. It's like earth thrown into water. It needs to settle before the water is clear. Examining our mind in meditation, it is important to see that our senses create stress. I see something that is alluring, interesting food, a beautiful person, music, a movie, something that I crave, like a new piece of clothing or a new friend or a new car or something, different climate or some sort of things that are different from what they are. Notice how the mind takes it through the senses of sight, sound, smells, etc., and clings to the wanting or the not wanting. These things which turn our minds outward towards the object of the senses and give the illusion that something is lacking. Well, the Buddha's advice is to choose one faculty in order to liberate all 6 faculties. The Buddha takes one of our senses and wants us to turn it inward and liberate us from all the rest of the senses. This entwinement of the senses and their objects is what creates the suffering when we add something to our original enlightenment. When we add the idea of wanting or not wanting, when we add an idea of a self that wants or doesn't want. So he gives the example of the sound of the bell. He has Rahula go and ring the big bell, and then he asks, "Do you hear?" And everybody says, "Of course we hear." And the bell stops sounding, and he said, "Do you hear?" And they all say, "No, we don't hear." Does this a couple of times, and then he says, ring the bell again, and he says, "Do you hear a sound?" And everybody says, "Yes." And he said, "Your answers are very confused." He says, "Because you're not distinguishing between the ability to hear, which doesn't disappear when there is no sound, and you're confusing the object of the sound with the ability to hear. So the ability to hear doesn't necessarily have to have an object." So this is a recurring theme that's going to culminate in how Avalokiteshvara gets his understanding by listening to silence, which is another way to see what we're doing in meditation. If we can just shift our attention from the babbling of the mind to like listening, just listening, especially listening when there's no sounds being made. Instead of getting involved in what the mind is doing, which is going to continually do, just generate ideas and thoughts, feelings, because that's what the brain does. And our job is not to control the brain, but to shift our attention. So instead of being involved in what the brain is doing, you can come back to just listening. And if you can hear anything when there's silence, that's fine too. But it's putting the attention not on generating thoughts or thoughts that are already generated, but it's shifting your attention to the stillness that is there all the time. There's something in the heart that is not disturbed, no matter what else is going on. But we can put our attention on that stillness instead of grasping after thoughts and things. So I'm going to read a section here. So this is the Buddha speaking. Nevertheless, since beings have allowed their attention to be drawn to sights and sounds, and have allowed themselves to be carried along with their stream of thoughts, as it has been since time without beginning, they have not yet awakened to and do not yet understand the purity, the wondrousness, and the permanence of their own essential nature. Instead of attending to what is everlasting, they attend to what comes into being and perishes. As a result, in life after life, they are mired down in impurity and are bound to the cycle of death and rebirth. If they turn away from that which comes into being and perishes, and hold fast to what is true and everlasting, then the light of the everlasting will appear, and as a result, the faculties, their objects, and the sense consciousness will fade away and disappear. By entirely disengaging yourself from the two impurities, defiled mental processes and defiled emotional attachments to those processes, your Dharma eye will become clear and bright. How then could you fail to go on to realize a supreme understanding and awakening? So Ananda then asks this question. I only hope that the greatly compassionate one will be moved to deeply pity us who are drowning in the sea of afflictions. How are the knots of our bodies and minds tied? And where do we begin to untie them so that we, and the suffering beings of the future, may be freed from the cycle of death and rebirth, and fall no longer under the three realms of conditioned existence? Having spoken thus, he bowed to the ground, as did the others in the assembly. He shed tears as he eagerly awaited the sublime instructions from the Buddha, the world-honored one. So this is a very important question. The Buddha takes his hand and he's rubbing his hand over the crown of Ananda's head. Then Ananda and all the others at the great assembly heard the numberless thus come ones from the 10 directions speak in one voice, though in different tongues, saying, "Well done, Ananda. You want to understand the ignorance that you were born with, the source of the knot, what causes you to be born to the cycle of death and rebirth. This is your 6 faculties of perception, and nothing more. Also, since you wish to understand the supreme enlightenment, you should understand that it is through those same 6 faculties that you can quickly gain bliss, liberation, stillness, and wondrous and everlasting." And the Buddha again, Ananda again asked the Buddha, how can it be that the same 6 faculties that bind us are the same that cause us to be freed? The consciousnesses, by their very nature, are illusory, like flowers seen in the sky. In response to objects in Anda, there is a perception, and in response to the faculties, there are objects. Neither objects nor perceptions of them have an essential nature. They are dependent on each other, like intertwined reeds. Know, therefore, that the establishment of perceived objects, such as they exist separately within your awareness, is the foundation of ignorance. When objects are not perceived as separate from awareness, that itself is nirvana, which is the true purity free from outflows. Why would you allow anything else to be added to it? In other words, if you're seeing all of those things that we perceive as objects, as not separate from the Buddha nature, and we are not separate from the Buddha nature, we can see that the Buddha nature within us and the Buddha nature within those objects are the same thing. They are not separate things. But we create a separateness by clinging to this concept of a self. And so the next example that the Buddha gives is the analogy of the 6 knots, where he's sitting there and reaches down and takes a beautiful scarf and ties it in a knot and says to Nanda, "Now what is this?" And Nanda says, "It's a knot." Well, he goes through this 6 times. And he also pulls on one end of the scarf and he pulls on the other. Then he asks Ananda, is this the way to untie these knots? And Ananda says, no, you have to untie them from the inside. And that's exactly what the Buddha wants us to see, that we have to untie these knots that we have created by looking, for example, at the sound of silence, or looking at things without separating them from ourselves or the Buddha nature. And what we're doing in meditation is learning how to come back to that place where there is no separation between self and other. Okay, Brenda. Let's stop here for just a moment. One of the things we have to do in meditation is learn how to take difficult situations and open our hearts to them. This is what the Chinese character for patience is about. It's with the ship and 3 drums at the bottom and a sharp knife at the top. Thich Nhat Hanh talks about creating patience by opening a heart wide enough to hold those things that are difficult or painful, and not be separate or apart from them, but be able to hold them with a loving heart. What started me meditating, although I had read about Buddhism for about 10 years, but I had a car accident in 1966. And I had hit my head on the windshield, and I was waiting for the doctors at UCLA to take the glass out of my face. And so I was just talking myself into being still. Don't move, don't touch your face, don't blink, just be still. So I was telling myself these things. And I fell into a place where I was there and the pain was there, but the pain didn't hurt anymore. It was just sensation. And it's the thing that started me meditating while I was recovering from that accident. And because I wasn't in touch with that most of the time. And it's not something that I can turn on like a light switch, but it's what the Buddha is talking about here, that the wanting things to be other than they are, even in difficult situations, opening your heart to them, accepting accepting the pain, whether it's physical pain or emotional stress, the opening ourselves up to that and exploring what it is that we don't know. I had a friend who was dying of AIDS in the 90s, and I walked in one day. I knew he didn't want to take a lot of pain medication because he just wanted to be able to deal with this dying process. So I said, well, John, how are you doing today? He said, I had a new pain. And I said, well, what did you do with it? And he said, well, I explored it. And my heart, something in my heart just leapt for joy. What a beautiful teaching that was. The Theravadins talk about investigation. Investigating our ignorance, investigating our mind. And this looking at that pain and investigating it, exploring it, looking at it, asking ourselves, what is it that I don't understand? What is it that I need to do to awaken to this Buddha nature? So we have to look inwards in those moments of anxiety or fear. I was very upset when I missed my plane. But I was a lot less upset after having bought a new ticket and found a new place to stay. And realized there was a solution to this problem. And I could have a good shower and a nice meal, and even a few hours of sleep. And the point is that we don't have to carry the suffering around. We can look at it and see what it is that we can do to open our hearts to that, to find solutions to things that we don't understand. And that's what the Buddha is trying to demonstrate with the sound when there's no, the ability to hear when there's no sound of a bell, the ability to untie these knots from the inside. In other words, what do we have to do when we see that we've created suffering? What do we have to do when we're anxious or upset or fearful? And this looking inward, this turning the stream of compassion within, and giving up both knowledge and its recognition is the way Dogen describes how to harmonize body and mind. It's that turning that stream of compassion within, that's the opening of the heart. And this is our job. This is what we have to do. We do it in our meditation, and we do it throughout our daily lives. Whatever we run into, whatever kind of weeds we see flourishing, or whether we see the flowers falling, we can let go of the wanting or the not wanting, and just realize the fact that if we want the weeds to be out, we pull them out. We enjoy the flowers when they're blooming, and when they die, they die. That's just part of the process. And not wanting things to be other than they are is this uncomplaining all acceptance. Realizing that we have choices to make. And most of our effort to manipulate the external circumstance to make it the way I want it to be, it's all very nice if we can do that, but it's actually not the real solution. The real solution is the turning that stream of compassion within. Seeing that we can do something about how it is that we react, and learn the difference between reaction and response. The response is to take the forest and see what has to be cleared out to minimize the fire danger, without doing it from a place of view of emotional urgency. You just do it when you can do it. Pull the weeds when you have the time to pull the weeds. Use the weeds in a way that's good. Everything has the Buddha nature, so the weeds can be compost or fodder for the forest floor. But the important thing is how we observe things, how we see things, and whether we see ourselves as separate or apart from the Buddha nature. So that's our talk for today. Homage to the Buddha, homage to the Dharma, homage to the Sangha.